Grable, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. This is the second webinar of the Capacity Management series. Our last webinar was we talked about how to become a shipper of choice, and today's topic feeds right into that and the importance of building a carrier management strategy and the initiatives needed to scale those partnerships for your supply chain. We've assembled again a panel of three transportation experts and giving us their perspectives and their viewpoints on a well thought out plan and strategy around carrier management. Before we get started and before I do introductions, I just want to take care of a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions at any time throughout this webinar, there is a chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions in there, and or you can tweet us at #carriermanagement. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our panelists today. First, and thank you for joining us as well, is John Turner. John is the Senior Vice President of Sales at Martin Transportation, and he has been part of the Executive Officer team since 2007. John has been instrumental in seeing Martin grow tremendously. The company has grown from 350 trucks to 80 million in revenue to now over 2,200 trucks and 4,500 trailers and 650 million in multimodal, multinational revenue. Thanks for joining us today, John. Our second panelist and second go-around here with the webinar series is Bill Madden. Bill is the Director of Transportation Management Services here at LeanLogistics. Bill's responsible, and his team is responsible for managing over $1.2 billion of freight under management across a very diverse spectrum of customer supply chains. He's instrumental in leading teams and delivering operational excellence and assurance of value. Additionally, in Bill's background, he has a deep knowledge of fleet and driver management as well as brokerage operations. Our third panelist is Tim Dalton. Tim joined us at our last webinar as well, and Tim directs the procurement services here at LeanLogistics, and he oversees all full service and DIY procurement projects for LeanLogistics. Tim has a deep background within the 3PL carrier marketplace and provides our clients with a level of expertise and knowledge base within that carrier network, assuring our clients success during their procurement events. So let's get started, and let's talk about this topic of carrier management. We look back at the last session and the pieces of what it takes to become a shipper of choice, and how to partner with the carrier community. Bill, I'm going to start with you and kind of just ask this one important question: is where does a company start in order to implement a carrier strategy?
Thanks, Troy. That's a very good question. There's so many components of a carrier management strategy. Getting started is sometimes the hardest part. But really, it's, you want to assemble your stakeholders. So if you think about it, you need to dive in and really invest the time and likely resources to boast alignment with all internal stakeholders, ranging from sales to customer service, warehouse operations, procurement, on down the line. That's going to require a level of cross-functional discussions around their specific goals and objectives. What are those different groups doing in pursuit of those objectives? What strategies are they focused on? You need those perspectives of those within your organization to assist in gaining really the better understanding of why they're doing the things that they're doing. And also uncover what your group is doing today that is working for them, but just as important, what is not, based on their unique needs. Overall, and I'd say even more importantly, you want to make sure that the goals and the supporting strategies are in alignment across the organization. Once that's understood and you've got that clarity on how all the gears are meshing together, you're really prepared to assess what opportunities exist and where is change possible. By getting everyone on that same sheet of music, you're really empowering everyone to share directly and supporting that broader organizational goal in their own unique, specific functional areas. You know, it's not uncommon to find one functional area within the supply chain group, or even possibly different departments, all together working diligently to support a strategy that may conflict with facilitating really the broader continuous improvement strategies of the organization, and are essentially sub-optimizing the machine as a whole. You know, one example that comes to mind for me here recently I encountered was I was working with a procurement group within a commodities division, and they had an initiative to maximize margins on the sale of their products. Go figure, right? That's pretty intuitive. What this meant for the distribution team, however, was that they were finding themselves notably challenged to manage effectively a high volume of short lead time orders. Often those were happening the same day, and that really drove an increase in spot market utilization. It eroded some of the carrier relationships, and that ultimately led to increased costs and oftentimes lower service levels. The net result was, you know, the increased cost they spent on transportation exceeded the increased margins realized by the procurement group using the strategy they had in place. And it really just had a negative impact on initiatives that the account managers and the CSR groups had, who were then focused on improving their customers' experience. So this is a great example of why it's really important for the left hand to know what the right hand is doing and why.
Cool. Thank you, Bill. Tim, let's shift it over to you. You're living in the world of procurement and interfacing with carriers, and through your career you've interfaced with thousands of them. What do carriers think when they hear of a shipper, you know, implementing a carrier management strategy?
You know, I think initially, you know, when folks hear about, you know, a strategy, you know, initially at times there can be some concern as far as, well, what does it mean to me, or what's going to change? And, you know, I think with that, and I think what a lot of them find and a lot of them actually appreciate, is the more that a shipper that they're working with, you know, takes the time to truly develop a strategy, you know, I think most carrier partners actually see that it benefits them because there's a lot more clarity that's added into the process as it relates to expectations. You know, as Bill mentioned, you know, one of the biggest things when you're all getting together initially is to assemble all the stakeholders. You can make sure everybody's on the same page, and then ultimately you can discuss from a priority standpoint, you know, what are the main things that you want to focus on, and from there, you know, with that transparency and that communication that will come from that group, but then ultimately trickle down to your carrier partners. And I think with going through your priorities and really understanding where you're at, you know, you can really start to identify, you know, who your white glove customers are, you know, overall, what are your different, you know, service expectations, you know, and really taking the time to look at yourself as well to make sure that you understand, you know, where could you do better? So maybe you can do better as it relates to getting drivers in and out of your facility. You have the audience, you have the stakeholders, you know, you get to buy and you implement that into a strategy as well, which then ultimately helps your carrier partners. You know, taking all that information, understanding your business as a whole, and really starting to define what that strategy looks like. You know, most shippers will then take that information as well and layer that into that procurement process. So when they're going out to market within that procurement process, they can eliminate as many of the unknowns as possible, which is what your carrier partners appreciate. You know, they don't want to have to guess, because they want to be able to put their best foot forward, and they want to be successful, and they want to handle your business in a manner in which you expect. And for them to effectively do that, they need to understand what the business is, and they need to understand what they're signing up for. So, you know, to Bill's point, I think it's assembling that group, getting that buy-in from that party, and then really kind of, you know, starting to dig into what are the issues, you know, what are priorities, how can it relate to your procurement practices, how you present your business, and ultimately, I think from a strategy standpoint, it's beneficial to
you. You've seen so much there at Martin, and probably have seen shippers with and without a carrier management plan in place. What insights do you provide, or what insights can you provide our shipper audience today that they should consider when implementing a carrier strategy?
Well, as Bill alluded to, there is a process of goal alignment that needs to take place. And I guess from a carrier's perspective, I'd like to throw out the number 60%. And that 60% number represents how many hours of a driver's logbook is utilized driving the tractor. And in regard to that, would also say, as goals are laid out and strategies are set, as Tim mentions, strategy is structure, and creating that 60% number as the most visible way to deal with the carrier's internal cost crunches and driver retention issues. We get asked, how do you become a shipper of choice? What can we do to help the drivers? Are there driver appreciation weeks and cookouts and handouts, Coke or Pepsi or hamburgers, whatever makes the environment while the driver's waiting for things to get done at my facility? How can I enhance that and create a better environment? And from our perspective, the focus wouldn't be on putting showers in or making the environment better, but in fact making that transaction of loading and unloading equipment happen more expeditiously, and turn that utilization of drivers and tractors and trailers that we've already purchased, that's already out there as an available asset, and turning that asset utilization number up, being more effective in utilizing all the effort it takes to retain and recruit drivers. Because as we get asked, what are we going to do as a carrier to improve that driver hiring and retention, and how we can work together, ultimately all the break rooms and showers and amenities that can be put in place are helpful, but the answer is not that. We should start by planning and working together on where we tie up those drivers and work through the process of what's happening there that needs to change, and align together on that goal.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I appreciate those insights and your transparency and honest feedback to our audience today. Let's move on to the next point. What are the tools needed here? So, Tim, I'll start with you. What tools or data should a shipper be paying attention to when they're implementing this carrier strategy?
Yeah, I think data is key, and I think, trying to find the data and make sense of it is probably one of the most important things. I think right now we live in an age where, if anything, we got so much data around us, and the difficulty is being able to again, make sense of it. From a procurement standpoint, as stated previously, it's really trying to understand what your business looks like, and then how can you portray it to your partners. It's understanding, from a seasonality standpoint, what your business looks like. Do you have peaks and valleys where your needs are going to change, and understanding, whether you have just overall peaks and valleys in your business, whether they're more geographical based on different commodity plants that you're moving freight from. And I think taking all that data that you have and layering it into that procurement process where you're effectively portraying that business, and again, from a volume standpoint, you're identifying that if you got a lane going from A to B and there's 12 annual loads, that you're showing if there's any spikes to that. Typically when you're communicating with your partners and they're working through an RFP event, if they see a lane going from A to B and they see that there's 12 annual loads, they have to assume that there's going to be one load a month, when in reality you may have 11 of those 12 loads in the month of November. So again, it's that transparency. It's getting folks the information and the data that they need to truly understand your business, and looking at it as, if you have a lane A to B and there's 12 loads and they're all falling in November, you're better off to have a partner look at that and say they don't want it than to think that there's one a month and to bid on it and be awarded the freight and then ultimately to fail on that particular lane. I think as well, from a data standpoint, it's understanding, your carrier partners, who they are to you and what they mean to your organization. From a classification standpoint, are they long-haul, niche, regional-based carriers? Are you giving them what they need to be successful? Are they living up to their commitments, and are you living up to your commitments as well? So it's really understanding, from past RFPs, really looking at some of the awards, making sure that that you're comparing your RFP awards to what reality is. And then if you find that there's an issue, it's going back and understanding why. Is it that your care partner just failed on the length? Is it that Bill gave an example before about the issue when when there was a lot of short lead time. Are your freight short lead time, where you basically are putting your partners in a position where they have no choice but to fail, and they've essentially already failed once they've accepted the load? So I think data is key, but again, there's a lot of it. So it's really trying to find what that data is that's most relevant to your business and helps you to accurately portray your business and make the decisions around it, and ensuring that you're taking that information and you're being as transparent as you can when communicating with your partners.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. That was some great information. Bill, let's flip that question right back over to you and kind of tweak it a little bit. What tools and data do our shipper customers pay attention to in their carrier strategy?
A great question. So it really comes down to leveraging the visibility I have. Tim had mentioned we've got so much data. What should we use? What's important? I think John made a great point. You can have showers and cookouts, but if you're not turning the trucks in a timely manner, those showers and hamburgers might be in vain, right? So having a solid suite of visibility tools and really understanding what the key points of interest are is a must. And you got to ask yourself the question, can I fairly assess how my carriers view me as a shipper? A few examples include that dwell time that both Tim and John have talked about. How long are our trucks at the gate, and are we turning them appropriately? What are the market rates? Benchmarking, for example, are the rates that I have in place today going to retain the carriers that I want on my team, and in some cases maybe even need to support my business? What are my average days to pay? Are the carriers satisfied with when they're seeing that check in the mail? Having that suite of business intelligence is going to be absolute key to shaping your strategy and really zeroing in on where you want to focus. Now, on the flip side of that same coin, as a shipper, you're going to want to be equipped with the right business intelligence tools to shed light on areas of opportunity regarding your carrier's performance. And that's going to be best done if you've got metrics that are mutually agreed upon with your carrier base. This is how we are going to measure you. Examples include on-time performance, even by location, tender acceptance overall, but even down to the granular level of lane specific, and regarding carrier commitments. What is your routing guide compliance? It's important, for the operations group to have that granular carrier-specific data points to really drive discussion with the carriers and really enable them to make intelligent decisions. Are your carriers doing what is expected of them from a capacity commitment standpoint, and are their service levels where you need them to be? Leveraging data is going to take the emotion out of the conversations. It's going to enable productive discussion. You may find a carrier's business has changed in maybe one specific lane that just doesn't work well for them today, where it might have last week. Or you might find that there's something within your control that is currently not doing well to set that carrier up for success. But you've got to have the visibility. You've got to understand what metrics are important to really be able to decipher what is really happening in each unique case. And really, to summarize it all together, having your carrier scorecard as well as a shipper scorecard for yourself is going to be a must to be successful. You got to stay committed to establishing the right metrics, monitoring those metrics, taking those data points into conversation with the appropriate parties, whether that's internal or external, and then really allowing that data to drive the decision making in regards to where are we going to implement these continuous improvement strategies. However, at the same time, this has to be supported by leveraging those same data points to measure the impact your actions are having. If I push down here, is something going to pop up over here? You need to be able to use those same metrics to understand how effective are the changes that I'm implementing, supporting the continuous improvement efforts I've got in front of us.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate that insight. John, I'm going to flip this over to you, but I got to imagine our audience is probably sitting on the edge of their chairs like I am, just wanting to hear it from the office of a carrier. And what tools or data should a shipper look at from your perspective when executing upon a carrier strategy?
Well, as Tim and Bill both allude to, it comes down to that data and the idea of how granular you need to get. Sometimes those issues that we all face are not across the board. There is a specific lane or a specific receiving location or shipping location involved that's really the root cause of it, and it could have a domino or does have a domino effect on other attempts to make on-time pickups and so forth occur. So what we do at Martin is we take every event and we map it into a report that's very detailed, and the first condition is that if we're not on time, we don't put it in this report. So we have to meet the expectation of being on time. Once that's occurred, we take every load and document on the loading side and the unloading side how many times in whatever sample set we grab, a month, a quarter, a year, how many times does the tractor trailer driver get released within 1 hour of that appointment. Then we create a second bucket between 1 and 2 hours, and then we go over up to an individual hour up to over 4 hours. And as we evaluate, A, the business we're currently doing and have been routed on and committed to, how do we see some aberrations in there causing concern, something we need to sit back down with the shipper and talk about. We'll bring that out, and again, with that, we have all the details regarding how many POs or cases and all the details of that load, the weight, that might help indicate where that root cause could be on the slow unloading. It could be the time of the day the appointments are set. And once we have that data, we work through the issues with the shipper. It may involve just not doing it anymore or whatever resolution is mutually agreed to. As that is also data we have access to when we reprice or go into any new event, we also would access that, and we may just decide that's not a lane we want to solve. We don't have the solution for it. It's something that our access to change is not going to make the change happen. It's just the way the business is. So the rate would be super high, or we may not even price it altogether. We have one example, a large receiver that under 2 hours, 31% of the time when we deliver on time, arrive on time, the truck is unloaded under 2 hours, 31% of the time. And in that same company, it takes more than 4 hours, 36% of the time. So if you looked at that as the poster child of how you can really have a lot of problems regarding what rate you put on it, whether the driver might quit, it's a very impactful event to continue to do that. So we, through this visibility, work with our shippers to resolve it. The costs are simple, though. Our service suffers. That 31% of the time is very hard to project our next load and how much time the driver will have on his logbook to drive and get to that next pickup. Less capacity is there because the truck's sitting at the dock that much time. It's now that logbook that's burned. And then ultimately, if the rates are going to have to be covered by us, we would charge more, or potentially that next carrier would charge you more too. So where we should be on that drive time, 74%. So we're at 60%. If we optimized, we'd be at 74% of our drive time. Logbook would be logged at 74%.
Excellent. Thanks, John. You know, looking at the next question, it's critical to understand what those next steps are to secure our carrier partnerships. And John, I'm going to toss this question back over to you. And have you answer it from obviously the Martin Transportation perspective, but what suggestions would you provide our audience today on the next steps to either building, enhancing, or scaling their carrier strategy?
Well, as we went through this exercise together, I took a few notes or wrote a few keywords down as Bill and Tim spoke. And strategy, structure, white glove customers, transparency, data, dwell time. When we throw all those together, it comes down to a really good opportunity for working together to fix something that ultimately could cause a win-win-win situation. And in a sales perspective, you always are taught the first minute you're in sales, you've got to work for win-wins, and it's like impossible. How can you charge money for something and everybody be happier? But we do have an opportunity to do that. The idea of fixing that loading and unloading dock time would pay a dividend in multiple ways, in 3 ways. Because the 60% drive time number is so low, it has a very high opportunity to be improved on. 74% would be optimal. If we hit that optimal number, right now, Martin, we turn down 12,000 loads a month on average. 12,000 loads a month. If the drive time were moved up to 74% in our driver's logbooks, the drivers we already have hired, the tractors and trailers we already own, we would haul an additional 8,000 loads a month. 8 of those 12,000 loads could be hauled. And then what would our driver paycheck look like? What would our retention look like? All those are wins now that even go beyond the win-win-win. The drivers are obviously very difficult now to keep with CSA scores and various challenges on the road itself. So if we could look at that as our ultimate goal together and use the structure and strategy and our data and know that as a goal alignment, that would be the win. Working through those challenges, and some of them are very difficult, but we have access to drop trailers and various modes of logistics management that we could employ. Our better service, our more available capacity, and our lower rates would pay that value proposition that we're all in business to add.
John, if I could just jump in there for a minute. This is Bill speaking. As I can't help but break out my calculator here, and you had made the suggestion that if you could improve that drive time to 74% or 78%, it's another 8,000 loads per month. As I back into that, we're talking another 96,000 loads annually. If we just use rough math and say the average cost per load is $1,000 per load, what I heard you just say is Martin would have the capacity then to manage another $96 million in freight under management annually. As many of the shippers are on the phone, that's a very sizable freight spend. And that might be your entire freight spend. If we could just make that marginal improvement on dwell time, certainly that would go a very long way on several fronts.
It's pretty exciting if we put any effort towards it, the payback. So obviously sometimes the question comes, what is my payback? I think you've illustrated right there what it is.
Excellent. Thanks, John and Bill. Thanks for the calculations. Those always bringing $96 million of revenue back into the business. I'm sure no one will have any gripes about that. Tim, let's flip it over to you again. You work with so many different carriers, not just Martin, but just a lot of others. And what are a few suggestions that you can provide from your seat and your lens that you look through for shippers to, again, build or enhance and scale that carrier strategy?
Yeah, thank you, again. I'm probably going to sound like a broken record from today's call and the last webinar, but communication is key. I think as Bill put the calculator away and kind of thinking back to some of the statistics that that John mentioned. There's opportunities that are out there, and this is an example with one carrier. There's not all of a sudden going to be a tremendous amount of new capacity in the marketplace. So it's really working through that carrier strategy piece to really understand, okay, there's not all of a sudden going to be an additional amount of capacity that I can tap into. So how can we take the capacity that already exists and be able to to get more of that capacity. So I think from a communication standpoint, check-in standpoint, communication's key. As you put together that strategy, and we've already talked about the importance of being transparent, it's also important to make sure that building into that strategy, you're putting in a meeting cadence with your core carriers where you're able to get together and really listen. Understand what the issues are and really work together to solve an issue. Every time you pick up the phone to call your partner, it's not necessarily all about, beating them up for something that you think they did wrong, but it's really, looking at those challenges, looking for solutions to fix those challenges, but also really understanding what all parties are facing from a struggle standpoint and working together to fix some of those issues. So if it's the dwell time that we've all stated, which ultimately can benefit shippers by increasing more capacity, on the road, those are the things that you really need to be listening for. Again, communication is key, but with anything, just taking the time to assemble your stakeholders and to understand what your priorities are and put together a strategy and, then put it up on the shelf and, say, okay, I'm good, for the year, that's not going to work. If you're gonna adopt the process, and if you don't have a strategy, if you're gonna commit the time to creating an effective strategy, the important thing is to follow up and make sure that it ends up being a philosophy that you live by, that everybody on your team lives by, that continues to evolve as you learn more. But I think the biggest thing, with what we talked about in the last webinar and what we're talking about today, is that, for one, again, there's not all of a sudden going to be a tremendous amount of new capacity on the road. So the biggest thing that we can do is be transparent, talk to each other, and basically just listen. It can't be a one-way street. We need to listen to work together to come up with those solutions.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Bill, I'm going to flip this question over to you as well, and really kind of, from that seat that you sit in managed transportation services, what are the suggestions that you give that shipper community, our customer community, to really help and expand and grow and build that carrier strategy?
Yeah, another great question. So, in my experience, when it comes to logistics, the only constant is change, right? And with that in mind, I think it's a reasonably easy leap in logic to say planning to the best of our ability is going to be really the secret sauce to safeguard us from the curveballs that will be thrown our direction. So start early, right? You should be framing your capacity strategies specific to unique challenges really of every quarter. One of the things we discussed in our previous webinar was around that whole shipper of choices, the carrier strategy blueprint we engage in with our customers. And one of the key pieces of that strategy, or that blueprint, excuse me, is really capacity planning. Capacity planning is really just a strategy we engage with our customers to identify those future pain points. And to do this, of course, we're going to leverage a number of data sources. If I just at a high level kind of run through that, we're going to look in the rearview mirror. We're going to study historic seasonal trends, then consider what are the plans for the future, right? For example, maybe layering in that annual operating plan. And this is going to help identify those areas of change, right? Maybe you'll find we're going to triple our current volumes in these lanes during Q3. I think you'll leverage that market rate benchmarking I discussed earlier to help identify areas where you might be at risk based on your current rate structure and routing guides, where carriers would have little trouble finding a shipper, maybe in a comparable lane, willing to pay a higher rate. Especially, right, if this is one of those lanes that is at risk, not only from a standpoint, but this is also where you're seeing a lot of detention with your drivers. You're really at risk at losing that capacity to another shipper. In parallel with the benchmarking effort, we'd also recommend that you validate your tender acceptance by carrier relative to your routing guide capacity commitments. At this point, you've really got some great visibility to areas that are requiring some attention, and then the data needed to have the right conversations with your carriers around building that capacity to meet your future needs. This content makes for great use of time that you're going to invest in those business reviews with your carriers on a monthly or quarterly basis.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate your insights. That wraps our webinar today. We're going to shift, though, into the Q&A session of our conversation here. And there's already a few questions coming in. And Bill, there's one that's coming in right now that I think is probably right up your alley. And it states this: I'm doing some of these things, as you mentioned, as key attributes. Which one is the most important that I should start with?
No, that's a great question. So as we've gone through the webinar today, we haven't necessarily touched on every component of a well-rounded carrier strategy, but piggybacking on it, assembling the stakeholders being key. I think on the heels of that, a second area of focus I'd recommend is putting together what we like to call our carrier groupings. So if you consider a list of characteristics about your carriers, things like what is your spend with those carriers, what are their coverage areas, performance history, just to name a couple. You begin to group your carriers in your network into, for example, your partner carrier group or your core carrier group or niche carrier group. The naming convention really isn't that important, but once established, leveraging these groupings to create, I guess, your engagement strategy, right? So from there, your engagement strategy guides how are you going to interact with your carriers based on the groups you have them placed in. As an example, you might touch base casually, right, every other week or so. Maybe have a routine quarterly business reviews with that core carrier group, where the frequency of how often you're touching base might be a little bit more relaxed with your niche carrier group, where you might protect a lane from going to market, maybe accept an above market rate on a number of lanes from your partner carriers. You might set the expectation with your core carriers that every awarded lane must be earned, really considering both cost and service.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. As other questions come in, I think this question, Tim, might be right up your alley. We're hearing a lot about the capacity crunch, but at the same time, I'm still receiving a lot of calls from carriers to get my freight. Why do I even need a carrier management strategy?
Yeah, I mean, to your point there, I'm still getting phone calls as well. I think if anything, carriers are they're still looking for business, and they're looking for the right business. So just because they're calling doesn't mean that there is a lot of capacity in the market, and that everything that you're hearing isn't correct. It is still correct that there is a capacity shortage. But again, I think a lot of those carriers focus in on the right business as they're all becoming a little bit more selective. And as we mentioned in the last webinar, as carriers are really starting to look at those opportunities through the eyes of the driver. I think, to Bill's point, when we talked about this carrier strategy today, we didn't necessarily hit on any of the components. We really just hit on a few of them. One of the big things in any carrier strategy that you should have is really, what is your process around vetting carriers? So, I'd say take the phone call, listen, to see if there's, that win-win-win type, scenario that John spoke to. And, from your vetting process, it's, having kind of a clear direction as far as, do you have a limit on, brokers, for example, that you want to work with? Do you have any kind of limit, or I guess, if anything, rules around, a financial history of a partner, or the size of the partner, or how long they've been in business? Really, of any of those attributes that can really guide you to the questions that you're asking to understand whether this is a partner that you may potentially want to explore those opportunities a little further. I think the big thing to understand is that everybody's busy. Right now where we are with capacity, carriers are being inundated with load opportunities. John mentioned before that they're turning down 12,000 loads a month, so you can only imagine how many offers they're being made. For the ones that they are taking. So I think the more that you can have a clear-cut strategy in place and understand that when you pick up the phone, the more of an opportunity that you can either move forward or, tell the person on the other end of the phone that you're not interested. And, even though they may not want to hear it right then and there, it's better than wasting their time and stringing someone along if you have no intention of actually working with them to begin with.
Yeah, that right there, the last statement, building the relationship, not stringing people along is a good way of having a strong relationship. Hey, John, there's a question coming in right now, and it states this: as capacity tightens for your customers, what creative things have you seen your shipper customers do to secure that capacity?
In regard to the commitments we make, we really dial those in. They have visibility when we work with our customers to say, here's what we've got you expecting for capacity on a weekly basis from a facility and in an individual lane. And what we've seen is that where we had always presented that data and given visibility to it, our sales guys can pull it up on the laptop and show them what our account managers and anyone at Martin, including the guy who sweeps up at night, could actually get in there and look at it. They want to see it. What do we have? What do you have me down for? This is changing. I need to do more. And it may not be that we can always just jump that number up, but they know that we manage that way, and they respect that commitment, locking that expectation in. Sometimes people see that the other way around. They see it as a noose or a bad thing. And together, if we look at it right, we can see it as a way to footprint through a regular expectation on capacity, what's needed, the lanes that need to be serviced, so that we don't get 5 opportunities in one lane that we're not really your primary guy on, and we took all 5 of those, while we then left some other lane where we were the primary carrier to dry, and then you've got that shuffle that has to occur. You're going to plan B with those other loads. So the long answer, short answer is they ask us, what do you have me in, and let's reconfirm what you've got down is accurate.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Well, looking at the time, I know we're hitting that time slot that I want to be respectful to our audience and their time, and we're going to wrap up. But I wanted to just give a special thanks and shout out to John and coming on here and sharing your insights and your expertise, and obviously to Bill and Tim. Greatly appreciate you taking the time to speak to our audience today. And thanks to our attendees. Greatly appreciate you dialing in today, and want to just let you all know that after this webinar, there will be a version, an on-demand version of this webinar at the LeanLogistics website. You can go to LeanLogistics.com and download it and listen to it. As mentioned before, this is a webinar series, and we'll be having our 3rd webinar on September 18th. And we'll be discussing and tackling the topic of metrics and how do I measure, my success of being a shipper of choice. This is a topic that you, the listeners, have asked for, and we're going to reassemble a team of panelists and again, kind of deliver the insights and thoughts around that topic. So thanks again for everyone attending. Thanks again to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing and hearing from all of you on September 18th. Have a wonderful day.